Our second passage today comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, verses 16 through 20. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In his first letter to Amazon shareholders back in 1997, founder and CEO Jeff Bezos wrote, "This is day one for the internet, and if we execute well, for Amazon.com. 20 years later, Amazon is one of the biggest, most successful companies in the world. And in his letter to shareholders written last month, Bezos shared that he was recently asked by someone who noticed that he still talks relentlessly about day one, "Jeff, what does day two look like?" His answer, day two is stasis, followed by irrelevance, followed by excruciating, painful decline, followed by death. And that is why it is always day one. Bezos spends the rest of the letter explaining how you fend off day two to maintain the vitality and drive of day one. It is a letter well worth reading. One of the points he makes is that the larger an organization becomes and the more history it has, the harder it is to maintain a day one state of mind. Today in our reading from Matthew's Gospel, we witness a day one moment for the early church, the post-resurrection Jesus telling the disciples, "Here's what's next. Here's where you go now." The writer of Matthew's Gospel made a conscious choice to end his version of Jesus' life and ministry this way. This particular gospel was written for a community of believers with roots in the Jewish faith, which is why Matthew is constantly referencing the Jewish scriptures to prove that Jesus was the one the Jews had been waiting for. But the early church community to which Matthew wrote was also a group of people struggling with internal division and conflict. It was a community longing for direction in a complex world, a community desperate for a sense of mission and call, a community trying to figure out how to maintain the vitality and drive of day one and not slide into the complacency and decline of day two. In other words, it was a community of believers not so different from our own, or from the thousands of churches across the world today gathering together to worship God and wondering, where do we go from here? How do we make disciples when we're still figuring out for ourselves what discipleship looks like? How do we, with our limited human and financial resources, make any difference at all in the overwhelming social issues of our day, like poverty, racism, human trafficking, and political division? How do we maintain our relevance in a culture where there are many different ways for people to find meaning and purpose? With the final words of his gospel, Matthew gives his community, and by extension, all of us who call ourselves Jesus' disciples, a day one mission and a calling. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Then and now, this is our task. To go to the nations. In other words, to go outside our walls, to go to the stranger, the one we don't know, and share the good news. You belong to God. God cares about you. This, after all, is what baptism is all about. In baptism, we proclaim that we are God's and that we are here to love God by loving others. Go and make disciples. Then and now, this is our day one calling. The problem is, we live out this calling in the midst of incredible uncertainty, which is the nature of a day one mission. It is not yet written. We have to figure it out as we go. Sheryl Sandberg is the Chief Operating Officer of Facebook and a best-selling author. She's known for her attention to detail and her organizational skills, the hallmark of which is her attachment to color-coded sticky notes. Several years ago, while on vacation, her husband, Dave, dropped dead at age 47 from an undiagnosed heart condition. Sheryl's life was immediately thrown into the chaos of shock and grief, compounded by the fact that Sheryl not only had her own grief to process, but that of her two children, ages 7 and 10. In a recent interview, Sandberg reflected on this time. Until this happened, she said, certainly I'd faced challenges, everyone does. I'd gotten divorced very young, and that was something that was hard to get over and process. But there was no order to Dave's death, because it didn't make sense that a grown, healthy man who woke up in the morning and went on a hike could just die, literally could go to the gym and die out of nowhere at 47 years old. And my story, she goes on, and I think the story of so many people facing hardship, is this balancing act between no control, no order, accepting the grief, accepting your emotions, and trying to find things we can do that give us some sense of control. Not long after Dave died, Sheryl was in a conversation with a friend who worked as a documentary filmmaker. Seeing her struggle to gain control over her grief, he told her that when making documentaries, he'd had to learn to accept that he couldn't write the stories of his films in advance. He had to let them unfold. Sheryl, he said, you have to let your grief unfold. You can't put it in a box and wrap it up. There is no sticky note for this. There's no Excel spreadsheet. You have to let this happen. When those first disciples received their day one mission to go and make disciples of all nations, they must have been exhilarated and they must have been terrified. Because this mission Jesus gives them leaves out an awful lot of the details. They would have to let it unfold. And although Jesus promises to be with them always, it will be in spirit, not in body. So they are getting ready to have to grieve his loss all over again. Grief, exhilaration, fear, these feelings mark a day one moment. Such moments always involve standing on the edge of something completely unknown, where the next step forward is a leap of faith. When we look back at such moments, sometimes we see them in a positive light, but at the time, the experience of living through them is incredibly painful. Day one moments reveal to us that we have much less control over our lives than we would like to think. Theologian Richard Rohr is constantly reminding us that suffering of some kind is the only way the human ego will give up its attachment to control, because the ego steadfastly refuses to hand over control unless it's forced to. So suffering, according to Rohr, becomes a necessary step on the path toward true transformation. Because who of us would take on suffering voluntarily? It pretty much has to be forced upon us. Throughout the Bible, we witness God's people again and again confronting suffering that they do not choose for themselves, but that ultimately leads to transformation and new life. Abraham and Sarah's inability to have children. Moses, stolen from his birth mother and raised in a royal household, only to discover as a young adult that the people, his people, were the ones enslaved by his adopted family. The Israelites wandering for 40 years in the wilderness, then finally reestablishing themselves in the promised land, only to be conquered and driven into exile in Babylon. It is to these people of God in exile that the prophet Isaiah speaks the word we heard today. And what Isaiah says is that if the people want to make sense of the present and have faith in their future, they need to look to the past. Because it is in the past when we remember our other day one moments, where we discover that God has a habit of showing up when we are our most desperate, to lead us into a future we never could have imagined or predicted. What's confusing about this passage is that right after the prophet calls the people to remember the past, he says this: "Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing." Now, these verses have been used and abused liberally to justify and manipulate communities into trying something new. But we can't understand them accurately when we pull them out of their original context. Isaiah is speaking to exiles, refugees, people struggling to make sense of the trauma and grief of having lost their homeland. They have lost all sense of urgency and vitality and joy that comes with being God's chosen people, because it feels like they have been singled out for suffering. For them, it feels like day two, stasis and irrelevance, followed by slow, painful decline, then death. Into this grief and despair, Isaiah reminds the people who they are. God's chosen ones, the ones whose lives God transforms against all odds and in ways none of them could imagine, again and again. God is the one who makes a way where there is no way. So which is it? Are we supposed to look to the past to help us figure out what to do now, how to move forward? Or are we supposed to forget the past and try something completely new? Isaiah would say yes to both of these questions, and he would add that we look to the past not to figure out what to do or to do things the way we used to do, but to remember who we are, our baptismal identity. We belong to God, the God who makes all things new. As individuals and as a church, we are in God's hands. Isaiah calls us to remember God's work in the past, but to let go of exactly how God did it. Because since the very first day one, the way God works is and always has been to create life out of nothing, love out of hate, hope where there is only fear, to make a day one out of what looks to all the world like day two. Did you know that our oldest original congregation, Second Presbyterian Church, failed the first time it formed? 20 families left the First Presbyterian Church, now Old Stone, to form Second, and although they tried mightily, they could not sustain the church, either through membership or financially, so eventually they returned to Old Stone. 5 years later, members of Old Stone once again felt this calling to plant a new church, and so they tried again. And the Second Presbyterian Church was organized for the second time. This time it grew and grew until a new church building was built to accommodate the 200 plus members, and with a new building, membership grew steadily and then the building was destroyed in a terrible fire. Everything was lost except for one small lecture room in the back of the church, which is where the membership continued to gather for Bible study and Sunday school. Eventually, generous members of the church funded a new building constructed on Prospect and East 30th Street. Now, these are just a couple of examples from our nearly 175-year history, but there are many more. Jeff Bezos might argue that an organization with a long history is challenged to maintain a day one state of mind, but I would disagree, and I think Isaiah would too. Because Isaiah calls us to remember our past as a way of remembering who we are and how God works, so that we can see all the ways God has taken what looked like day two moments and turned them into day one. So if it feels like you are standing on a precipice, if your future is murky, if you're wondering how it's all going to work out or where to go from here, may you and may we all look to the past not to figure out what to do, but to remember who we are and who we follow. Looking to the past, may we find the courage to do just that, to follow, which means relinquishing control, letting go, and opening our hearts and minds to where God's Spirit is leading us. This is how we continue to be a people and a church for whom it is always, every day, a new day one. Amen.